Well, welcome to another webcast of A Mirror Darkly. Today we're going to be looking at the question of if there is such a thing as truth, and how do we go about finding it.
Sorry, forgot to turn down my media every time.
Every single time. Yeah, so how do we find out about the truth?
Well, first you got to turn your media down so that you can hear.
Apparently.
Yes, that would be the first
That
step.
would be the first step. Be very helpful.
Yeah.
Get the technology under control.
Yes.
So last week we looked at epistemological issues. Epistemology is a big word that means how do we know that we know anything. And this week we want to look at, well, if there is such a thing as truth, then how do we go about discovering that? How do we wade through all the everything to figure out what's real and what's not? My undergraduate work was in history. And one of the required textbooks that I had to read actually had a class in it, which was on research methods. And actually when I went on to UCLA, my graduate program, I had to take another research methods class. I actually think my undergraduate research methods class was the better of the two classes. It could just be because the second version I had at UCLA was just repetition of everything I'd already gone through.
Why'd they make you do it twice?
Well,
Maybe for people that are coming in from other schools?
yeah, that is,
Okay.
UCLA had their program the way it was set up, and that was one of the required courses for my particular program.
Okay.
And it was taught by a nice Egyptologist. She actually had experienced a lot of gender bias because she was a woman, and she was probably about 80 years old at the time she was teaching the class.
Wow.
And she was one of the first Egyptologists to not be a man. And she struggled to actually make it in the field. She ended up getting a degree in library science because she had to do something to make a living.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it was really
That's too
hard
bad.
for her. So she told us stories about that, which I thought was quite interesting. And yes, it was very sad. But anyway, so she taught us a lot about how to use the library at UCLA and how to use the card catalogs, how to use what was brand new at that time, computer terminals to look up things.
And microfiche?
Yeah, I had to learn how to use microfiche. Of course, I learned how to do that as an undergraduate because there were things that I had to look up that the library of the small liberal arts college I went to didn't have, and so I'd go to other research libraries and they would have microfiche and microfilm, and so I had to learn how to use those things. So it was back in the dark ages, card catalogs, Elenchus, Bibliotheca Elenchus, which was kind of like, if you remember, those of you that are old enough, Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature.
Uh-huh.
Well, this was for scholarly works. It was a
Okay.
great big fat thing that was produced by the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome.
That's a lot of syllables.
Yes, it is. And it was just a massive compendium of every single thing in the field of theology, linguistics, just anything. And so I learned how to use that and would access that at UCLA when I had to do research. And I had used it previous to that, though, as an undergraduate doing research, too, at libraries other than LA Baptist College.
I had forgotten about that, the Guide to Periodical Literature.
Yeah, now there's something online called JSTOR, JSTOR, I think it is, and it's essentially the same thing, but now it's all computerized.
Right.
Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you have to pay to be able to fully make use of it, but it gives you the entire documents, not just, with the Elenchus, you just have the title and a little bit of a description of it, and then you'd have to try to find that journal in the library that you were at, assuming they would even have subscribed to that particular obscure thing you had found, and then it might be on microfiche, and yeah.
And someone else may have checked it out before you because it's so popular, right?
That's right. So it's just your time spent doing research was the bulk of the time that you spent writing something. Thankfully nowadays the bulk of writing something is the actual writing.
Right.
Research is quite quick and easy, which I like. But that's something we need to talk about. And this book, The Modern Researcher, which was written by Jacques Barzoun and Henry F. Graff, was a standard textbook for research methods, particularly in history. but it applies to any field. The book is relatively expensive. It's quite cheap when I was in school, but then textbooks used to be cheap before
Right.
student loans and all that, and everything got extremely expensive as a consequence of the free money.
Yes.
But you can still find used copies of the book and earlier editions. The current edition is like $200-something. You can find used copies for as little as 10. And if you don't have a copy of it and you're listening to today's broadcast and you're interested, I'd highly recommend it. It's available on Amazon. The second book that we had to use was called Historians' Fallacies Toward a Logic of Historical Thought by David Hackett Fisher. And it's much more reasonably priced. I'm not sure if it's still in print. Again, you can get it off Amazon and relatively cheaply. And the nice thing about that book is what he did is he showed things that you should not do, mistakes to try to avoid, and he used examples from really good historians that had made these kind of errors. And he wasn't doing it to try to laugh at them, but just to demonstrate, these are mistakes that are easy to make. Even the best historians make them. And that's one of the key things to keep in mind about trying to find the truth, doing research and doing it well, is that the mistakes are incredibly easy to make, even after you've learned how to do the research. Mm-hmm. Now, the vast majority of people have no clue how to go about doing research, and that's part of the problem.
Well, especially now that, this is what I'm noticing, now that the available knowledge is so vast,
mm-hmm.
people just read something and assume it's true.
Right, and that's always the mistake.
Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of the issues are coming from with just a lot of stuff in the news and
mm-hmm.
A lot of things that people believe to be true, like keto diet stuff and anti-vax and things like that. Because people don't know how to see if a source is
reliable. They don't know how to do the research methods. One of the key rules of thumb in research is skepticism. One of the flaws that human beings have, and this is universal to every single human being that has ever lived on the planet, every single human being that's alive now, every single human being that's watching or listening to this, it's true of me, and this is what's called the biased mindset. And that's our tendency as human beings to believe things quickly that confirm what we already believe to be so. That is, the bias of confirmatory evidence. And so I like to give the example that if you've decided you hate, say, people who eat pickles, anytime you see someone who eats pickles that does something despicable, you say, how typical. Look
Can
at
you
that.
not smack your lips, please?
Despicable. Despicable. Pickle. Despicable.
I didn't know I was smacking my lips.
Every time, sometimes when you're talking, I'm like, oh my god, stop.
Interesting.
So try not to, please.
Okay.
I
Well,
was about to
unaware
walk
of
off
it.
and just because it was triggering me.
I was unaware of the problem. In any case,
It's like when mom tells me to stop slurping, it's like,
say you hate people that slurp or that smack their lips. And anytime you see somebody that smacks their lips and they do something bad, you think how typical of a person that smacks their lips that they would be doing this horrible thing.
That is true. That is
eh,
truth. Totally
yes.
truth.
If someone who does not smack their lips does the same despicable thing, you won't notice it. If a lip smacker does something good, you won't notice it. You only notice the lip smacker doing the bad sorts of things because that's what confirms your bias. This is how prejudice develops, bigotry, right? All these sorts of things, sexism, ageism. People make jokes about certain genders of drivers or certain ethnicities of this or that or the other, and it's
like
all
girls can't drive or something.
Yes,
Or
it's
bias about certain leaders of countries.
Or bias about certain races and all that.
Just
kind of
throw
stuff.
that in there.
white men can't jump, whatever. It's a consequence of this bigoted mindset, and it's an easy trap to fall into. And I see it all. I get very annoyed with people on Facebook. I get very annoyed at journalists. I get annoyed a lot. life is frustrating.
It really is.
But the rule of thumb is that if you see something that confirms your pre-existing beliefs, you need to be as skeptical of that as you would be of things that would challenge what you believe. And this is very difficult to do. As if somebody challenges your beliefs, you're all ready to be skeptical and to question it and to research to see if it's so. If somebody says something you already believe, well, all is well, and it doesn't bother you at all. You need to be just as skeptical of the things that confirm your beliefs as the things that challenge them.
There are
And
things
that's
that,
very hard.
like I was told as a kid, like my dad would say that a certain thing was true, and on the face of it, okay, it could be true. We had no way of finding out, though.
It wasn't
I can't
easy
think of
to
an
find
example.
out.
Right.
You'd have to use library.
Right. So, there was, I had no way of trying it out. So my dad said it, so I assumed it was true. And then I've said it, okay, here's an example that I thought of. The reason why you shouldn't touch the wings on butterflies and moths is because
They die.
no, well they will, but the dust that's on their wings
Their
comes
scales.
off. Shh.
Sorry.
Thanks. Okay. So you do that and you need to stop doing that. Anyway, the dust comes off their wings, and I told a student this because we had a ton of butterflies migrating through this year. And so then I thought to myself, well, is there really like dust or powder on their wings? So I Googled it, and it's actually their scales, but when the scales come off, they're like powder or dust. That's what it looks like. So my dad was right, because it is like powder or dust that comes off there, but it's actually their scales, and it's actually what their wings are completely made of. So then I went back to the students that I told that to, because they were playing with them on the playground and they were like picking them up and stuff. And I told them just to sit and look at them. So I explained to them it wasn't powder, it's their scales, but to us it looks like powder, but it's an essential part of their wings to help them fly. So anyway, so that is an example of something my dad had told me that was true that ended up being not entirely true. But it was the perception at the time, and probably if I had looked up in a book about butterflies, I might have, if I was looking for that answer. But
Right.
back in the day, just a lot of those I wonder questions weren't really worth the effort of going all the way to the library and looking it up, and then, going, oh, then I learned this thing. You usually went to the library when you had to research something. So now it's nice that we can just go to our phones. Like my mom will go, I wonder what blah, blah, blah is. And I go, this is what it is. She's like, well, that's so convenient. She doesn't do it, but she waits for me to do it. Or she'll call me, can you look this up for me? You're so good with that Google.
Oh yeah, it's so terribly difficult to use.
Yes. Well, when you're 78 and have a hard time seeing your phone,
I
yes.
suppose. But anyway, there's some things, some rules of thumb, some cheats, if you will, that will help you.
Hacks.
Hacks. That's
Yes,
it.
truth hacks.
Truth hacks.
That's what we should have called this episode, Truth Hacks.
Yes. So number one is the primary importance of facts. That seems self-evident, but priority must always be given to tangible, objective data and to external evidence over subjective theory or speculative opinion. Facts must control theory and not vice versa. Source material must always be scrutinized in this light. And it's surprising how often people allow speculation or theory to dominate what they decide to believe. If it doesn't fit, again, it's the confirmatory bias, the biased mindset. If it doesn't match my political, religious, ideological viewpoint, then you are skeptical of it. If it does match my religious, political, ideological viewpoint, then I just accept it without thinking. And that's a mistake.
Yep.
And that keeps you further from finding the truth. The second thing that is critically important is the primacy or the importance of primary sources. As in research, you always want to try to seek out the original source material, seek to discover the origin of any tale, legend, or incident.
How can you read this in those small letters? I
Because
have glasses
my eyes
on.
work.
And I have glasses on, and I can't even read it. It's just like
It helps that it's backlit too. It's easier to see when it's backlit.
Anyway, for instance,
Sorry.
the story of George Washington. The story of George Washington chopping down a cherry tree originates in a book written by Parson Mason Locke Weems entitled The Life of Washington that was published in 1800. The story appears nowhere prior to Weems' book. He attributes it to, quote unquote, an aged lady who was a distant relative and when a girl spent much of her time in the family. He does not name her, and so his source is impossible to verify. For instance, if you find a quote attributed to someone.
Like Abraham Lincoln's quote about don't believe everything you read on the internet?
Yes.
Okay, that's a good example.
That's a good example. What you want to do when you find a quote attributed to someone is to see if you can find book, speech, something specific that it's tied to, and then find the page number and be able to look at it in the original source. If you can't do that, if you just go to WikiQuotes and there it is, that's not verifying it. You have got to find the original source document. Now, one thing that can help you is if you, say, are a scholar of a given individual, like Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, or you're familiar with the way things sounded during those eras, you may notice a quote that somebody attributes to them, and you'll immediately be skeptical because it doesn't sound like them. The other important reason for checking the original source is that it's very easy to take someone's words out of context or to leave bits and pieces of what they said out. Context is critically important in these sorts of things. But you always have to go back and find the original source. And if you don't want to spend the time finding the original source, then say you're on Facebook, it would be wise not to repost this wonderful quote that you think is so important or so confirming of your biases. Again, if you think it confirms what you already believe, you immediately have to be incredibly skeptical of it and doubt that it's true.
I ran into something kind of like this week. I've been working a lot on ancestry with my family tree, and I was reading my grandparents' life story to my mom, the stuff I had pieced together with documentation and stuff. And when it got to their wedding date, she said, that's not the right wedding date. What?
I'm trying to look at mom, and you're moving back and forth.
Well,
I'm like,
his chair's way forward, so if you push your chair back, that'll help. So we're just
Sorry.
kind of all irritable today.
Apparently.
So
sorry,
anyway,
it's just
that's way better.
You were going like this, and I'm like, okay, well, Dad, stop moving.
So I can see. Anyway,
sorry.
So I had read on there that my grandparents were married on January 23rd, 1928. And my mom goes, that's not right. It's January 28th. She goes, you can even ask your uncle, and he'll tell you that it's January 28th. I said, well, that might be family lore. I said, but I've got a government document here that backs it up. And so I read the document to her, and I said, and they would have filled that out with Grandma and Grandpa being there. And that was the date that's on there. It was very clear. It wasn't smudged or anything. It was super clear. And she's like, well, it's still not right. They got married on a Saturday. And so I was like, oh. So then I went, what day of the week was January 28th, 1928 in Google, and that was a Saturday. The other one was a Tuesday. She's like, they would never have gotten married on a Tuesday. And then she gave me the whole scenario for they had to get married like in the basement because my grandmother, who was Dutch Christian Reformed, was marrying a Baptist minister, and so it was.
What a scandal.
Yes, very scandalous. I wonder how it would have been if she'd also been pregnant. But anyway, and actually my mom was talking about the parlor in my grandparents' house. The only time the parlor was used was when this group of men from the Dutch Christian Reformed Church would come. They were like the elders of the church. She said they would sit on the platform behind the pastor, and they would critique his sermon. So when he was done, they would go through and tell him the things that they didn't like, the things probably nothing they did like, just everything they didn't like. Anyway, so this group of men would come to your house because you were in trouble for something you did, and that was my grandfather was told that my grandmother was no longer to fellowship with their church because she was marrying a Baptist. And so, yeah, the horrificness of it. Anyway, so this whole story around it. And, but now I'm believing my mom's story more because it matches up that it was a Saturday. Highly unlikely that people got married on a Tuesday. So it was probably an error, and it's handwritten in the record book. So it's it's likely that it could be wrong. So,
but that's how you do research.
Uh-huh.
That is, you take all the different little bits and pieces of the facts, and then.
Oh, and here's another one. So there was a plane crash in Lake Victoria, like 2 or 3 days after my uncle was born, and my mom remembers it because she was like, I don't know, like 4 or 5 when it happened, and my grandmother was still in the hospital after having given birth, and she had to be evacuated from the hospital because of this plane crash, and they needed space for the victims, if there were any. Anyway, so she's giving me all these details that she knows about this plane crash. She goes, so I was kind of young, so I'm not entirely sure how many people were killed or anything like that. She says, I want to say this many, but I don't remember how many it was. Anyway, so I just typed into Google, Kisumu, Lake Victoria, plane crash, and then I put the year that my uncle was born. And there were 2 other plane crashes within days of each other, but they were in July. And so one was a plane of South Africans either going to Egypt or going back to South Africa. They weren't sure, but it crashed in Lake Victoria on takeoff. And it was a DC something. No, not DC. It was a cargo. It was a C-17.
47.
Maybe. It's an old one?
C-47.
C-47. Okay.
As cargo variant of the DC-3.
Okay, that's what it is. Okay. So anyway, and then there was another one that had like 28 people or something that were killed in it. And then the other one was, there were only like 6 people, and it was a military plane of some sort.
C-47s were used.
Kisumu Airport was a refueling stop, a very popular refueling stop. So anyway, so my mom was like, it's not either of those. And so I read to her all the stuff they had. It was people's accounts of what had happened. One man talked to an old man who had been there the day of the plane crash, and at first he didn't believe him, so he looked on this aviation site that it's aviation safety site of some sort. Anyway, it was information about the plane and about the crash and how many people died and all that. So whenever I put in facts that are just like family lore, that's what I say. Family lore says blah, 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 blah. And then, so that I remember it, so that if I do find documentation for it, then I can turn it into a fact.
Right.
So anyway, it's been super interesting doing that, and I love it. I get lost in it. That Bible verse
My
about...
mom gets hyper-focused on ancestry.
You know how that Bible verse that says, don't spend all your time chasing after genealogies or whatever?
That's a different...
Oops.
That's a different
I know, but you can really get sucked into it like 4 hours.
Yeah.
She gets hyper-focused.
Oh, Rick joined us from Puerto Rico.
Oh, he's at Arecibo. He posted some pictures of Arecibo.
Yes.
He said that he had yelled at the Arecibo dish, and then moments after that, I had liked the picture they had taken. He thought that was funny and a little creepy.
We're stalking you in Puerto Rico, Rick.
Apparently.
We're not actually here. We're in Puerto Rico just stalking you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is a green screen of the sound booth from the church.
And this is us dressed like we're in Lancaster, but we're not in Lancaster.
Right.
But anyway, another thing is that when it comes to original source material, you need to have a positive attitude toward it. That is, it should be innocent until proven guilty. That is, original source material can be mistaken, wrong. They can make mistakes in dating, that sort of thing. Also, depending
You
on...
can make a mistake in dating.
Yeah, you can date the wrong person.
Yes.
It could go badly.
Also, when you think in
I've done
terms
that so
of
many times.
the type of government or culture that you are looking the information up in, may or may not be entirely truthful in how they present information.
Right.
So, for instance, I've told the story multiple times about, this is fictional, fictional two-man race between Soviet athlete and an American athlete, two-man race. American won the race. Soviet press reported it as the imperialist American pig came in next to last, and the glorious Soviet athlete came in second.
Yeah. Well, I was just watching some stuff around
Truthful, but
Right.
just
around the time of Tiananmen Square, the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. It's when China was doing their big, pull out the military and we'll show our awesomeness, and all the way all of our guys goose stepped together. But there was not a word mentioned about Tiananmen Square. But then the American news was talking about it and running clips of it and things like that. So in totalitarian governments, changing history is like key to keeping power. So
yeah, well, they erase people from photographs. When I was taking history of Russia as an undergraduate, professor told us that the Soviets had an encyclopedia that they produced, and that when someone would fall out of favor, you would get in the mail new pages for the encyclopedia. You were instructed to take a razor blade and cut out the old page and put this one in its place.
Wow.
To rewrite whatever.
Sort of like Miss Holt with the Sports Illustrated, but she never put anything in place. It was just a hole
Yes.
in the shape of a bikini model.
But you would alter history to match what you wanted history to be. This is why in the novel 1984, George Orwell talked about he who controls the past controls the present and controls the future. And in a totalitarian regime, that's pretty much what goes on. That is, the past gets erased. Things that are inconvenient, things that we'd rather not know about, we'll just overlook it, pretend it's not there, wipe it out. And this is not new. Most people have heard of King Tut. The heretic king, who was his father. The only reason we know about him is because Amenhotep had built himself a new capital city because he felt the old one was corrupt and unclean because of the idolatry, because he insisted on worshiping only one god. Well, when he died, all the inscriptions throughout Egypt were defaced. Anytime his name would appear on a inscription, they chiseled it out. The only reason we know about Amenhotep is because we found his capital city, which had been abandoned and left to the desert, and so it had just gotten all buried. And so when that was excavated, suddenly, oh, here's a king that we didn't know about because his name had been erased from everything.
And that was the doing of King Tut, because that was Tut's father, right?
Well, it was the doing of priests and other people that didn't like. Amenhotep was not a popular ruler because he had eliminated the worship of all other gods except one.
That's right, and the priests were all out of jobs.
And the priests were all out of jobs, and that's part of the reason King Tut got such a nice funeral, is because they were very grateful for all he'd done in restoring the the old-time religion. But we have examples of that with other people and rulers in Egypt and elsewhere, where the powers that be will erase people from history. And so, for instance, this goes back to the inconclusive nature of negative evidence. That is, not being able to find something doesn't prove that it's not so. That is, you couldn't find anything about Amenhotep. It didn't mean he didn't actually exist. It's just that he had been erased.
It's an argument
from
from silence.
It's an argument from silence. Arguments from silence are notoriously weak. So, for instance, Moses, biblical character of the Exodus, does not show up on any Egyptian records. But given the nature of Egyptian society, anything that would have had his name on it would have been erased.
Right.
So, because he certainly embarrassed them.
Right.
An example of that, where we do have two competing sets of records, is with Sennacherib. He conquered and invaded the northern kingdom of Israel, and we have records from his regime of his conquests. And it talks about how he would attack a city, lay siege to it, and then destroy it and take it over. And you can see the movement of his army from north towards the south, towards Jerusalem. When he gets to Jerusalem, he says, I laid siege to Jerusalem. I had Hezekiah caged up like a bird in Jerusalem. And then he moves from that to the next city. He doesn't, and this is significant, mention ever conquering Jerusalem. And the reason that's significant is because when we look at the biblical account of what happened, the Bible tells us that yes, Sennacherib laid siege to Jerusalem, Hezekiah was caged up, and Isaiah is the prophet at the time, and Isaiah tells him not to worry, God's going to take care of it, and 180,000 or however many there actually were, of his troops died of a plague. And he was forced to leave because of that.
And he didn't want to mention that.
And he did not mention that. He just mentioned the positive things about having laid siege to Jerusalem, but the absence of the wording of conquest stands out because he didn't conquer it.
Right. So Rick was commenting that he likes the old two-man race story.
No.
He thinks that you used that years ago.
I've been using it for an incredibly long time.
Yeah, it's like my dad's Intelliwat joke.
Yeah, well, I find it
I love
useful to
Intelliwat.
illustrate the principle, and then I can show from history other places where that happens. Of course, it happens like with China, Tiananmen Square. The old Soviet Union do this. The Nazis did that. It's very common for unpersons to be erased from
To be unpersoned.
to be unpersoned. The other thing to pay attention to, and you talked about this already with your genealogical work, is proper approach to parent discrepancies. That is, you try to harmonize the different bits of information that you have and come up with explanations for why there are the apparent contradictions. Now, one of the things from history with the contradictions, particularly if you're looking at original source materials, is to keep in mind that we don't have an absolutely complete accounting of what goes on in the past. I mean, the amount of information available nowadays for everything that happens is just overwhelming, which creates its own set of difficulties. But the further and further back you go in time, the less and less materials have survived to the present. And K.A. Kitchen, in his book, The Bible in the Ancient Orient, pointed out, he's an Egyptologist at, I think it's Oxford or Cambridge, or at least he was. I think he's retired now. But he pointed out that when you think in terms of, say, digging up ancient Egyptian things or ancient Mesopotamian artifacts, 90% of the material and information from those distant times simply doesn't exist anymore. Of the 10% that has survived to the present, only 10% of that has been surveyed. That is, somebody's gone out and says, yes, there's something buried over there, at least that much. Of the 10% that's been surveyed, 10% of that has actually been excavated, where people have actually gone, done the archaeological work. And with modern archaeology, the excavations are selective. That is, you don't excavate the entire site. You excavate certain segments of it. The reason being that you want to save things for future archaeologists as the technology and techniques improve over time. So you don't want to destroy it, because in the excavation you are destroying stuff. So anyway, 10% of what has been surveyed has actually been excavated. The 10% that's been excavated, about 10% of that has actually been published. That has gotten from the archaeologist's hands into the scholarly journals, which tells you that what we know of the ancient world is an incredibly small bit of it. Another, I don't know if it was Kitchen or somebody else, said that in examining the past, it's like we're trying to figure out what the past looks like and what it was like to be there by looking through a soda straw and trying to imagine reality from what we can see through a tiny soda straw. So it's not surprising that the information that we have of things in the past is fragmentary and incomplete. And so contradiction is not going to be overly surprising just because we're getting bits and pieces of the information. I mean, you see that kind of thing even reflected in like modern news reports. The first 24 to 48 hours of any news report, a lot of what you hear is going to be wrong because you're getting firsthand impressions and he said, she said,
And people just trying to say I was there when they weren't, so they make stuff up.
yeah, and so you're not really getting a good, clear picture of things. And it's only over time that you can find out better what actually happened. But even then, and this is the thing to keep in mind, when we start going into secondary sources and tertiary sources, that is beyond the original source materials, is the matter of bias becomes an increasingly big problem. When you're doing research, one of the things you want to make sure that you do is that you look at the material, whatever it is, from as many points of view as possible. That is, do not rely on just one political, religious, ethnic, ideological viewpoint. Years ago, I was given a book by, what's his name? I got it here. Larry Burkett, called The Coming Economic Earthquake. It came out in 1991. Little skinny book, and he was predicting that the economy was going to go to hell in a handbasket in 1991, and we'd have a horrible depression, and everybody would lose everything. And the essence of the book was to argue against debt. The unfortunate problem with the book is that the man had no clue how to do research. That is, all these things that we've talked about to this point, he violated pretty much all of them. That is, he didn't seek out primary sources. He relied on tertiary or even later sources. All of his sources were from the same political and economic point of view. And he didn't pay close attention to finding out basic facts. So, for instance, on page 27 of his book, he's criticizing Roosevelt for making use of John Maynard Keynes' ideas regarding how economic systems work. There is a fundamental problem, though, with what the author of the book does at that point, which, if he had bothered to look up some basic facts, he would have figured out. And that is that the way he words it is that Franklin Roosevelt was born to wealth, raised to wealth, and educated in wealth at Harvard, where he was exposed to the philosophies of Dr. John Maynard Keynes of England. Keynes, an avowed socialist, had long advocated the use of government control over banking and business to ensure prosperity for all, blah, blah, blah. Keynes was born on June 5th, 1883. Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882. Roosevelt was slightly older than Keynes. They would have both been college students at the same time. What are the odds that Roosevelt would have been studying Keynes?
That's true. Yeah.
See, right there you know that the whole thing is nonsense.
Well,
Plus also,
Hillary Clinton being named after that guy that first went up Everest or first went to the South Pole or whatever.
Everest.
He did that like after she was already born.
Right.
Yeah.
So she couldn't have been named after him.
Yeah. Unless her name was Ethel and her mom changed it to Hillary.
Maybe.
So.
The other thing, too, is, I actually had economics in college, and so I knew that Keynes wasn't a socialist. And so for this author to be calling Keynes a socialist, right there I knew there was a problem. But he made all sorts of mistakes of that nature in the book. I actually wrote him a very nice letter pointing out some of these errors. I got a letter back from an underling saying, oh yeah, where some typographical errors crept into the book. No, these were fundamental errors of fact and not a matter of opinion. They're just basic errors of fact. There are a whole series of these things. He blamed the inflation in Germany in the Weimar Republic on the Kaiser of Germany. Well, the problem is that after World War I, the Kaiser was dethroned and went into exile in Holland. He had no control over the German government after that point. So he had nothing to do with what went wrong with their economy. He was not the one responsible for printing money and creating inflation of 1,000,000% per year. So just stupid things. He also blamed Nixon for removing silver from our money, which, since I'm a coin collector, I knew that the silver left our coinage in 1964. Nixon didn't become president until 1969. Really hard for Nixon to have had anything to do with that.
Yeah.
So just basic facts, if the man had even used an encyclopedia, he would have avoided some of those errors. But then, as I looked at his bibliography, the people that he listed, they all quoted from one another. And it was kind of like circular firing squad. And they all had the same ideas, same attitudes, same point. And so the book was utter nonsense. What's really sad is it won awards, and in fact it got published to begin with. And so, yeah, I have problems with that sort of thing.
So, okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk about was, and this is with the rewriting history idea. So, growing up, I was given a very sanitized view of what slavery was like for the slaves in America.
Right.
Not slaves worldwide. But anyway, what slavery was like. That there were some that were actually well taken care of by their owners and things like that. And if you watch Gone with the Wind, my favorite movie, and no matter what I love about slavery, it's still my favorite movie because it's a great piece of art. But that they were pretty good to their slaves and stuff and everything.
Aside from not paying them.
Right, but they gave them houses and somewhere. Anyway, so I started reading. Haven't finished it yet. It's sitting on my Kindle.
Frederick Douglass.
Yes, Frederick Douglass's autobiography. But so, which gives you a much more uncleansed version of it. But by the same token, too, he's going to have certain biases that.
Well, he was a slave.
Right. So he's
but
going to.
He's a primary source. There.
Right. So the things about his life, you can pretty much hang your hat on, or at least say, according to Frederick Douglass, this, and this happened.
And then you can look at other slave accounts, and
see
there's a
if it's
lot
the
of
same.
them, and you'll find a certain commonality among them, which gives you a better idea of what
Right.
slavery was actually like in the
Yeah.
United States or in the southern states.
Yeah. So.
It's quite horrific.
Yeah.
One of the advantages of knowing history, knowing how to do the research, is that it does give you better perspective on things. One of the scary aspects of modern journalism, and it's not just modern journalism, it's kind of the nature of journalism as a whole, is that an awful lot of the people that are journalists do not know how to do research. Back in 2004, I was a volunteer with the X Prize Foundation during the launches of Spaceship One. And the area that I worked in there was media relations, which meant that I worked with reporters. I got to tell them where to go, for instance. I remember one night, it's like 2 a.m, just before the second launch. And this poor woman was wandering, trying to figure out how to get back to the communication center there. Now, of course, I have a bad sense of direction, but yet I was able actually to get her to where she did. It's amazing thing
like
that
a
we're still
miracle.
not wandering around at the Mojave Spaceport lost.
I would have come to look for you.
I'm sure
It was
you would
quite a few
have.
years ago.
But yeah, she was very happy that I got her to where she needed to be. But one of the things I noticed with the journalists, that is, one of the things that we had produced were press packets, which gave them exhaustive information about everything that's going on, biographies of all the pilots, just all sorts of information. When they had their press conference afterwards, it's like none of them ever read the press packet.
They probably didn't.
They probably didn't.
Because their job is to ask questions, so they just want to ask you questions.
Well, the other annoying part of that, though, is that this journalist would stand up, ask Bert Rutan or somebody else up there a question, sit down. Next journalist stand up and ask the exact same question.
Because they don't listen to each other either.
He'd sit down, next journalist would stand up and ask the exact same question. After about the 20th time, you could see that Bert Rutan was getting really,
Really
annoyed.
irritated. Yep. And you can't go, ask your friend over there. I already gave them the answer. See, I can do that as a third grade teacher because kids will do that.
So you had
They'll ask
to
me
be
the
polite.
same thing that I just said, and I'll go, ask your elbow
He's somewhat a
partner.
grumpy guy to begin with. But it's amazing to see him
Should
holding
do
it
the,
in.
Not yet. We're about
Well-
15 minutes away.
No,
Yeah, we are.
it says it's
quarter
almost
till.
an hour on my thing.
It's 4:48.
It's not. Well, it is almost an hour, but it's pretty far away.
Yeah.
So, well, Rick said that facts aligned
No,
with
'cause it
bias.
says it's at 58 minutes right now.
Okay.
That's not what we're basing it on.
Okay.
Well, it's the same exact thing.
Facts aligned with bias mitigates against checking. Unfortunate. And then
Yes.
bias is pretty easy to detect. Bias through omission is a bit harder. Yes.
Yeah. And so one of the things to do, say that you want to know what's actually going on, is to try in like news stuff, is to try to get behind what's reported on, say, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, whoever, and try to find the raw data behind that. I posted, you were mentioning this earlier, the thing I posted on, how people die
Oh.
and what gets reported in the news and what's the big thing in the news versus the percentages of how people die. And it's like it's flipped on its head.
Well, you would think, based on our news, that everybody's dying in mass shootings, and actually, your chances of dying a violent death, which that would be included in violent death, is really small.
Yeah, it's 0.9%.
Heart attack and cancer are the biggest statistics.
Yeah, of people that die, 0.9% die of homicide, which would include all possible methods of homicide.
Right.
The other thing, too, that people don't realize is exactly how few people actually die each year. It's less than 1% of the population. So out of the 1% of the people that die in a given year, 0.9% of those are dying of homicide. Actually, it's almost double the number that die of suicide. It's like 1.7% or something, 1.6% die of suicide. What takes out most people is what you would expect: heart disease, cancer, other illnesses. Violent deaths are very, very, very low.
But it's interesting because
Terrorism doesn't even show up as a line item hardly.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting, though, because I'll have these conversations at work. Like, we'll hear about 2 or 3 people that have cancer, and people will be, oh my gosh, what's going on around here? Everybody's getting cancer. It's like, no, like 2 or 3 people did. And part of it's our age, because at my school, particularly, we have very few young teachers, and most of us are veterans. And so, you know, we've lived hard lives. We didn't have seatbelts, and, you know, we sucked on lead paint. And so some of that's coming back to get us. And so, you know, people are getting cancer. Like, my mom has been battling cancer for the last almost a year. And so it's like, oh my gosh, now everybody in my family has cancer. No, she's the only one. Actually, besides her, just my dad's mother. She had colon cancer, died of it when I was 16. But,
And
like
cancer deaths are actually on the decline.
yeah. Well, and then my doctor, like, it freaked out because my grandmother died of colon cancer. Well, nobody else in the family has had any kind of cancer.
How old was
And
she?
it has to, she was like 68 or something when she died. But it's a first degree relative that makes your percentage higher. And I told him, she's not a first degree relative. He's like, well, what did your dad die from? I go, my dad died basically from congestive heart failure. His brother died from high blood pressure, and his other brother's still alive, and he's the oldest. And he's like in his 800 something years old. So, you know, it's like, I'm not real worried about the whole cancer thing. I am more concerned about the heart thing because my uncle died of stroke. My grandmother on my mom's side died of stroke. Or if you ask my cousin, when they called the deputy to the house just to make sure that everything was above board, nobody questioned the circumstances of her death. The deputy said, so do you, my cousin is a nurse. He said, do you know what she died from? And he said, LOL LTL. And he goes, what's that? And he said, little old lady lived too long. But she basically died of stroke. My grandfather just died of old age. My grandfather on the other side died of congestive heart failure from being a heavy smoker. Why are you freaking out?
They keep on calling me.
Who?
Scam likely.
Oh, then just ignore it. Scam likely is an idiot. You don't want to talk to him.
They always text me or call me.
I know. I
Like,
get them all the time.
Right when I'm doing something important.
Okay, let's go back to this. So I just couldn't figure out why she's freaking out. Anyway, so you know, the high blood pressure heart issue is more of a concern to me than even cancer. Cancer's not really on my radar because, I mean, it could happen, but I'm not going to sit around and worry about it. What I need to be, that and skin cancer. My dad had skin cancer. My mom's father had it, and but it wasn't like the kind you die from. It was just the kind you have to have removed all the time. So I'm really aware of that. Like if I get something new on my skin, I watch it, and then I see the dermatologist about once a year, once every 2 years, because that's on my radar. But dying, like this whole thing, like at school about, you know, some schools are doing active shooter drills where their teachers are actually getting shot at with like paintball guns, with blanks, but it's like the firing noise, and not in our district, thank God. We had an active shooter person come and just tell us what to do, and some of the things we were doing statistically were the wrong things to do. So we have a better plan now. But spending a whole lot of time worrying about active shooters, not on my radar, because it's highly unlikely that it's going to happen.
The probability is very low.
Yeah.
One of the things that can help keep things in perspective for people, and if they're consuming news, is to spend a little bit more time consuming some history. Mm-hmm. It'll help you put the current era into perspective. That is, we are not living in the most violent time in human history. We are not living in the most politically divisive time in human history.
Yeah, I think the Civil War kind of beats that.
Yes, the Civil War. Keep in mind, you know, think back to the Civil War where we actually were shooting each other, and more soldiers died in the American Civil War than American soldiers have died in all the other wars we've fought combined. This was a nasty
and soldiers
thing.
dying in war now is far less than it was back in the day.
Percentages are even less because of modern medicine
and modern weapon
technology and everything. But the reality is, I keep recommending his book. People keep ignoring me. Well, it's a big book. It's 800 pages long. Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. He's come out with another book in the last year. Bill Gates gave it to all the graduates of 2018, I think, all the college graduates for free. And it's Enlightenment Now. And it's a less heavy version, I could say, of the previous book.
Thinner pages or less pages?
Less pages.
Okay, not like
but in any case, either of those books are useful because they give you some of the raw data. Again, the importance of original source materials. And what you will find in looking at that, or if you want to just look at the data by itself, you can go to humanprogress.org or other sites like that, and they'll give you all the breakdown of what's going on in the world. You'll find that, for instance, extreme poverty has declined massively in the last 20 years to such an extent that the projection is that extreme poverty will be gone.
Don't tell the socialists that, because they live for...
Will be gone within 10 years.
Other information.
Healthcare is improving. Life expectancy is improving. This is the most peaceful, most prosperous time in world history. Healthiest time in world history.
And even though we're all fat, it's better than starving.
Yeah, that's the other thing, too. Again, keeping things in perspective. For most of human history, the biggest problem that we had as human beings was getting enough food to stay alive. Starvation was very common. I mean, even in the 1800s, people starved to death in France, of all places, which is weird to think about. What's the biggest health issue we have now? Obesity. Who are the most obese people in the United States?
Americans.
Poor people. This is completely opposite of the way it's been through all of human
Do you know what I
history.
said? I said
What?
Americans.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
well, Americans have been, generally speaking, better fed than most of the planet anyway. We've been,
When they say how fat we've gotten, I've been looking at pictures of like my family pictures and historical pictures because Ancestry will put in historical things. There's a lot of fat people in those pictures too. So you're not telling me there's like there's just a lot more people now.
there's
too,
more
so.
people now, and that's the other thing. That's just something else to keep in mind. The reason that the human population has skyrocketed over the last few years is not because more people are being born. It's because less people are dying.
But we don't
Fewer
have the
peop-
overpopulation problem that they predicted in the 70s.
Well, that's the other interesting thing. What's his name? Is it Singer? Well, the guy that
Singer?
wrote, what's it called?
While you're thinking, I'm going to
Yes.
tell this. This is funny. Rick said that some of it is situational. Like he never saw a diaper commercial until Alma was pregnant, and then they were everywhere. Well, it's like when you buy a car. Suddenly, I'm going to buy this car because nobody else has it, and then everybody on the road has it.
Yeah, it's not that everybody else has it. It's now you notice. Again,
yeah.
it's the biased mindset at
Right.
work.
Anyway, this Singer book.
I'm trying to remember his name. Anyway, he predicted that by the 1970s, by the 1990s, people across the world would be starving to death, and just all these horrible things would happen. And absolutely nothing that the guy predicted came true. Everything was exactly the opposite. He made
But
a
the
bet.
world is going to end in 12 years.
He
Just
made
know
a
that.
bet with.
Well, no, the world should have ended in 2012.
That was a movie. He made a bet on various commodities that they would. This particular guy said everything's going to become expensive, hard to get, rare, and everything went the exact opposite. It became more abundant, cheaper, so on. The thing is, and this is the sad reality of human beings, is that you will get more attention from the media, you'll sell more books, you're more likely to get elected if you predict bad things are happening. Because if bad things are happening, then we've got to fix them, and I'm the one predicting the bad things are going to happen, so
I'm obviously the one
I'm
who can
obviously
fix
the
it.
one that
yeah.
can fix it, and so you elect me. You're not likely to get a lot of attention for saying, wait a minute, things really aren't very bad. Things are actually getting
And
better.
I can make it even better.
And we could make it even better. Nobody wants to hear that,
No.
which seems weird, but that's the reality. Again, Stephen Picker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, website humanprogress.org. Highly recommended to give you a perspective on things that will help you realize that the news is rather sensationalistic and
Really?
not really giving
I
you
thought it was
good,
all
clear
true.
information about stuff.
Wow.
The
You
world
just
is
crushed
not.
my dreams.
The world is getting better, not worse.
Okay, let
But
Mom,
anyway.
let Mom read.
It's fine. Don't
Yeah, it is
interrupt.
5
It's fine.
o'clock,
That's fine.
so.
We can go over. We're not like on some network that that somebody else is coming up next.
That's true.
Just us here.
Nobody's.
And the old webcast was 2 hours long, so
Yeah.
and we sat in a hot box.
Now we sit in a box, but it's not hot.
Yeah. Well, it was for a little bit, but the air's on.
I'm a hot box everything.
Okay, you need to stop doing that so I can read this.
It makes noise.
Okay, A Mirror Darkly is brought to you by Quartz Hill School of Theology, which is online as well as in person. You can take classes, go to theology.edu, and you will find the classes there for free. If you want credit, you pay a nominal fee for it. If you are in the area, in the Antelope Valley, and you want to take some classes live, those are also offered as needed. Quartz Hill School of Theology and Mirror Darkly is a ministry of Quartz Hill Community Church. We are located at 51st Street West and Avenue K in Quartz Hill. So if you're in the Antelope Valley and you're not worshiping anywhere else, come check us out. If you want to check us out online, or if you're not in the area and you want to check us out or worship with us, we do a live feed on the Quartz Hill Community Church Facebook page every Sunday starting at 11. You get worship, you get the sermon, you hear the announcements, you get the whole 9 yards. We so far don't edit anything out.
Singing.
Yeah, I said you get the worship. So anyway, so join us through one of those ways. And if you are in the area and you're looking for a place to worship and learn more about God and make some new friends, come over and join us. We're at 51st and K in Quartz Hill.
Good.
Okay, you guys have
Next
a good one?
week, Lord willing, what we'll be doing is the value of fiction. Fiction is not the opposite of truth, although some people may think it. That is, we don't call fiction books lies. That's not the term for it. Or it's interesting. We have fiction and nonfiction.
Right, which confuses my students because they're only third grade, and I have to think about it for a second because you think, okay, true, not true, but it's fiction, not fiction.
Yes.
So that'll be interesting because
So we'll talk
it
about
confuses
fiction
third graders.
and what its value is. So anyway, we'll see you next week.
Bye.